Hello, everyone. Welcome to Teaching with Magic, a podcast exploring the intersection of education, fantasy, and literacy. Here at Teaching with Magic, we explore the different ways that teachers in the fiction and in the real world make magic for their students. You'll hear discussions about teachers and teaching methods in fantasy, science fiction, and pop culture. You'll hear interviews with scholars in various fields about important topics in education, and you'll get to be a part of an ongoing conversation about why the imagination matters. Welcome to Teaching with Magic. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Teaching with Magic. I'm your host, Elise Trudell-Cedeno, and I'm delighted to introduce today's topic and our special guest. But before I do, I have a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to address. First, thank you for your support and your feedback as our website and social media in general went through some significant changes. We had to downgrade our website due to costs, and unfortunately, we lost a couple of blog posts from 2024. This means that we'll be republishing some of our old work on the site, and you can find these posts on the Teaching with Magic Substack as well. You can still find us on teachingwithmagic.blog, and the site still has our podcast feeds to Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. We'll just also be publishing posts on Substack as well. I also want to remind everyone that you can support Teaching with Magic on Patreon through our tiered subscription system. If you go to the shop on the Patreon page, you'll find our brand new Lord of the Rings resource list. I made this list for my students a few years ago. It's a compilation of kid-friendly resources, books, YouTube channels, and podcasts that give my students clarity on their questions about lore and the finer details of Middle-earth. It also includes a list of Tolkien's publications, sorted by legendarium and non-legendarium works. I wanted this list to be free, but unfortunately, Patreon had a minimum price requirement. But if you subscribe to Teaching with Magic's tiered system, the resource list is free with your subscription. Now to the topic at hand. I've been holding on to this one for a little while because I'm well aware of the damage and hurt that Rowling has caused and continues to cause since her Twitter manifesto in 2020. On the one hand, schooling and examples of pedagogy in the world of Harry Potter are relevant to my research, and the Harry Potter series was one that shaped my love and understanding of the fantasy genre as a child. On the other, more important hand, the health and safety of my trans family and friends are more important than any book series can be. For this reason, while I still engage in scholarship with the Potter world, I choose not to contribute any funds or make money off of the franchise. All of the scholars that I engage with are independent researchers who actively trouble and criticize the Harry Potter series and all of the issues of race, class, and queer identities within the series and throughout the fandom. If this particular episode is not for you, please, I beg you, please skip it. Your health and safety comes first. I've also included book lists and resources in the show notes for you all to peruse on your own time. Now, today's guest is Dr. Katy McDaniel, co-host of Potterversity, a Potter Studies podcast. Katy is an Andrew U. Thomas Professor of History at Marietta College in Marietta, Ohio. While she specializes in early modern British history, she teaches various courses in world history, modern European history, the history of science, and historiography. She's the author and editor of several Harry Potter chapters, essays, and books, including Harry Potter for Nerds Volume 2 and Potterversity, Essays Exploring the World of Harry Potter. In today's episode, we'll be referencing an essay that Katy wrote for the journal The History Teacher, a publication by the Society for History Education, Incorporated. In this essay, Katy discusses the lost art of effective lecturing, and she uses Hogwarts History of Magic Professor Binns as an example of the importance of active listening and the teaching of history. Katy, thank you so much for joining Teaching with Magic again. I'm so happy to have you back and to hear your perspective as a history teacher on the teaching of history in a magical context.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Elise. I had such a good time the last time I was on, and I think this podcast is such a great idea, Teaching with Magic. It's just wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So today we're going to talk about Professor Binns.
Oh,
What is it about Professor Binns that we just love? I don't want to say we love to hate, but he's just so easy to criticize. And what I loved most about your I think what I love most about your article for the history teacher was that yes, this is what Binns does is not necessarily good pedagogy, or rather, it's not good practice. Like how he lectures isn't great, but the skills that we can get and learn from Professor Binns is still critical and important. So, what would you say was the best, perhaps, or the most insightful thing you learned about Professor Binns and the teaching of history for this particular article, and about how Rowling talks about history in her work, and even in the Wizarding World? You have another article coming out soon. Oh no, is it out? Is Ivory Tower out
it
now?
sure is. Yeah.
Yes, Ivory Tower Part 2, edited by another Teaching with Magic alum, Lana Whited, and frequent visitor of Potterversity. So that's out now. You've got an essay in there about how history and history of magic is portrayed in the Wizarding World website.
That's right. It's called Secrecy and Segregation. And it's really about how the split between the wizards and the muggles in the like pseudo histories of that are presented on the Wizarding World articles, that is enabling to the totalitarian takeover of Voldemort. And it shows you some real problems in wizarding society as well. So yes, I think that history is really important in the wizarding world as it is in our own world, and that J.K. Rowling is aware of that and is intentional about, in fact, her stories require always that the kids figure out something that happened in the past. Think about how they're searching for Nicholas Flamel for almost the whole of the first book, right? They can't find anything about him. And if they just known a little more history, right, they would have been able to do it. It's not like so much about magic as it is about the history. But then the history teacher that she gives us is really incompetent. And we've all had that kind of teacher. And it is a shame that not infrequently that those teachers are history teachers. I can't even tell you how many times when I say I teach history, people say, "Oh, I hated history." And I think it's just a real shame because history is not only about us, it's ours, but it's got the strangest, weirdest, most amazing stories that you will ever find. And I just think it's endlessly fascinating myself. But there's something about the way that often it is taught that squashes people's interest and joy and the feeling that it's relevant. And she's really hit on something with Professor Binns in that regard. And I love how she makes him a ghost. Like he's literally dead. Talk about
true.
Irrelevant, right? He's not even of this world anymore.
Yeah, he's just almost, and it's interesting how we think about ghosts in the Wizarding World as just an imprint of the past, or of their past selves. So who knows what Binns might have been like when he was alive? Like maybe he was a great dynamic teacher in his past, but he's just not. Or maybe he was also soporific and put everybody to sleep every day.
Yeah, and
Who
when
knows?
she has an entry about him on the Wizarding World website, and she says that this was particularly in reference to a bad teacher that she had, who had no awareness that there were actually students in the classroom that he was supposed to be engaging with in some fashion. I think that's essentially Professor Binns's problem. But we actually, like, the story is that one day, he was lecturing. One day he went back in his office and he fell asleep, and he got back up again to teach his class, and he was a ghost. right? He had
Yeah.
died and then never realized it. And he still kept teaching his classes. So of course they'll keep him on, right?
Right. It's like
That's
why,
classic.
it's a lot like Trelawney in that, like, all right, just you got the job, just keep going.
Yeah, he doesn't have a lot of expenses, I'm guessing.
Probably not,
There's not a
he
lot of
doesn't
food that
have
he's
to pay for food or board,
no health
he's
insurance for
there you
Professor
go.
Benz. So
Yeah.
yeah, but it also means he is totally detached from the immediate problems of the day, which of course
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge problem for history and historians and the way people think of it. Like history is this, dull, dusty volume of things that has nothing to do with our lives here today. And that's it's just such a misconception. It's so wrongheaded. You really can't understand what's happening today if you don't understand history. And
Mm-hmm.
often people figure that out later in life
Yeah.
and they're like, wait, I think I don't really even understand this. And then they have to go back and they realize, oh my gosh, this is so, there's so much here. And I can't believe I didn't really know about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we could, as a profession in history teaching, we could do a lot better, but it doesn't require getting rid of lecturing altogether. Of course,
Right.
lecturing can be done very badly, and Professor Benz is a classic example of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think you were talking about the scene from the Chamber of Secrets, right?
Yes.
Where Hermione dares to interrupt him. And he's like this isn't supposed to happen. He's not supposed to be actually asked questions. He's just supposed to be going on and on about Goblin Wars, which we
Mm-hmm.
do find out later were actually really important, but
Yeah.
you wouldn't know that from the way he's teaching it. And then he actually takes some offense at the way she's trying to bring history into,
The
present
present.
relevance. And that is, of course, another big mistake. And I know you talked about that yourself.
Yeah, I've written a paper where I analyzed Hogwarts in general through an active learning
Hmm.
lens. So what does active learning look like? And how do certain teachers do or don't do it? And Ben's definitely doesn't do it.
Yeah.
Um, I also gave the example, I think, of something that Binns could that the Chamber of Secrets episode was really a missed opportunity for discussing what makes for fact, what makes myth, and could we maybe there was what if there were some primary sources from that time in Hogwarts history that they could have analyzed. And Binns just goes, no, 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 this is, I'm going to teach you facts. What that is myth. But what's the difference? I mean, sure, there's like a literal time difference between what makes myth and what makes history, but how do we how do we discern those differences, and how do we teach students to discern those differences?
Absolutely. So many people are brought up on what we historians have started calling social memory,
Mm,
which is a kind of collective agreement about what happened in the past. And that's not always the exact same thing as history. And this is why sometimes, you know, college history classes are like iconoclasm 101, where you realize that Thomas Jefferson, right, had this relationship, that was not okay with a
mm,
slave. And, but you have to challenge those kinds of things. And the social memory version doesn't really portray that. And so you're sort of scraping some of the iconic or the mythological off of real world figures to understand them as human beings, which is, of course, pivotally important for us knowing that we can have agency in the world too, even though we're not perfect,
yeah.
right? But I totally agree with you that this failure to engage with the mythology of the Chamber of Secrets, is a real problem for him. And in terms of his teaching, because we do know there is a history there, and he's blind to it because he's just written off this part because it's interesting and because it's it's not so obvious. We don't maybe have a lot of evidence about it, and historians
Right.
can be really cautious about that, but we have to talk about those things. We have to talk about those things anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about when you were talking, um, in my world civilizations class in the modern world civ, I have students read about a variety of approaches to Indian nationalism in the beginning of the 20th century and end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And they read from a guy named Dadabai Naroji, who was actually a member of parliament in England as an Indian. And he is very much about, we've got to show the English that we can do what they do, but he's not actually in opposition to the British government. So the second person they read is a fellow named Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and he says, the British are exploiting us and we have to respond in kind with boycotts, with terrorist tactics, and as a kind of unprivileged group of people, we've got to be able to use the weaponry that the British use against us, but against them. And then they read Gandhi, of course, right? Nonviolent opposition. And then I have them talk about in this setting, which I think it's a little to the side of what most students are thinking about. It's Indian nationalism, right? It's a little bit, it doesn't feel relevant to them. But I have them talk about those strategies as general strategies, and what are the reasons why somebody might employ terrorist tactics? And what do we think about nonviolence? And there was one year where it was the Occupy Wall Street year. Maybe I'm dating myself, but you remember all that Occupy Wall Street and the students were out and there was all kinds of violence and, that was happening to the protesters. And I had a student who he was like, this nonviolent stuff, it's just so annoying. I don't know why they do that. I don't know why they would do that. It's so annoying. And then an Occupy Wall Street type student immediately launched in. And although we were talking about Indian nationalism, they were really talking about something contemporary. And I was like, oh, and I just literally, I ghost-like tried to vanish from the front of the class and let them argue it out. And everybody's watching, trying to see, but they were doing a really good job of representing the different points of view. And I tried to stay out of it and let them go on for a bit. And, then I came back in to try to, say like, this is why this is important. And I summarized kind of the different points of view on that. And that is an example of how you can, in a historical context, you can encourage that interaction. And when we think about how we can make the history classroom better, I think relevance, we can't shy away from relevance. And I also think we can't shy away from moral judgment, which is something historians have a hard time with, right? Because as historians, we have to try to understand people on their own terms. That's actually really very important. And not to just be judgy when they didn't always know the same things that we did. And, we can see their errors in a way they couldn't. But I think students feel moral things about the past. And ultimately, I think the idea that we want students to feel things about the past is the way to get them to be interested in it. So when I was talking in this article about the importance of lecturing is important for a lot of reasons, especially in history, because our past is a story. Even the word history has it in there. And I think my definition of what a human being would very much include that we make stories. I think to be a human being is to make stories. Yeah, I feel like your podcast is totally on point.
It's a bit on brand there, isn't it? Yeah,
that's right. Stories are so important to us. And even in our ways that we understand ourselves and our own lives, we put ourselves in a story. Think about the importance of memoir, but then the way that we understand our past is through story. And it's just really hard to convey the story of the human past through group discussion. You think about storytelling as a performative art. I actually have a theater background. We didn't have minors at my college when I was there, but I would have been a theater minor. I had enough classes for that. I always loved theater. And when I'm lecturing, unlike Professor Benz, I make sure that I have a sense of who my audience is. And do I have them in my hand? Or have I lost them? And they're walking out the door, staring out the window. And so you have to think about how you are connecting with that group of people who are listening to you. That is our responsibility as teachers, I think, and as storytellers. Another thing that you can do is, and this comes from a book called something like What the Best College Teachers Do that I referenced in that article. Ken Bain is the name, Bain. And what I loved about his book was he says there's not really one way to be a great teacher, because when people describe their favorite teachers, they describe all different kinds of types of teaching, including lecturing. And he says what makes really good lecturers is they use warm language. This to me is such a very practical technique to use. Part of it is speaking in the present tense.
Okay.
And also, using warm language to give psychology to what is happening, right? To get people in an imaginative space so that they can dwell in the moment. And again, that's a storytelling technique, to get people to be in the story, and to invite them into the feelings, the emotions of the people who are living through these incidents, and really encouraging that empathy that all history teachers are really trying for.
So then I would love to know a bit more about how Binns's mode of teaching, like this particular, the reason, whatever reason that Rowling decides to depict him as the boring teacher. How does that motive, what does that mode of teaching reveal to you as a historian, and you're interacting with a fictional context? Like this is a very fictional history, but what does his teaching reveal to you as a historian looking into this context?
So one of the things that I think is a real trap for historians, whether they're teachers or not, is becoming so enmeshed in your subject that you only relate to the subject and you don't relate to others who also need to know the subject. If that makes sense, right?
It does.
You get lost in the past. And I think Professor Benz is lost in the past. I mean, the fact that he's a ghost is the metaphorical way of saying that. And then, and I do believe that we have to understand the past on its own terms for its own sake. I'm not somebody who thinks you always have to make everything relevant to the present, but there has to be some acknowledgement that the past is alive in a way in the present, and that it only exists because we continually bring it up and interpret it. And if you're going to leave it dusty, and if you're going to talk about it in the way Professor Benz talks about it, it will be dead to the students who are not taking it in. They don't know that. They don't know the history. They don't understand how it works. Think about, did Harry get anything out of that class?
No.
He has to rediscover all those things when he's actually interacting with goblins, and he has to think, oh, wait a minute, it would be good to know. Right? Yeah. Why the goblins think the sword of Gryffindor belongs to them. Right? And that would be something that he could potentially have learned from history. But I will say this, like from the author's point of view, from Rowling's point of view, she can't give the kids too much help with that, or there would be no story. Right?
This is true. Yeah.
It's okay to have the teacher be an obstacle as a kind of plot device, because then the kids have to go do their research and they have to, they have to bring that up. But think about how much of an advantage it would have been to them to have that. I also think about Hermione, because another thing, people don't like reading history books because they think of them as dull. And Hermione is practically the only person, as we know, who's read Hogwarts
the history.
But how many times does she reference that because it's actually useful?
Yes, exactly. And if it were me, there are so many times where I've read this story and I'm thinking to myself, I want some history of magic homework. I would read that history text. I would read that. Maybe because it's a fictional context and because it's magical history. And, if you gave me, unfortunately, when my American history teacher gave me American history to read, I was like, maybe this is not my cup of tea. But, it's funny sometimes how we resist. I know we've talked about the Chamber of Secrets lesson, and I've talked about it from an active learning perspective, but I'm curious what you think about how this exchange reveals not just about Binns, but maybe about other historians or other people who might have a collective assumption about history as solely fact. And in your paper, you talk about history as a narrative discipline. It is storytelling. So, why do you think perhaps that Binns and others maybe think about history as quote unquote fact? We were talking before we started recording about the character Gradgrind in Hard Times. Like, we have to learn the facts. We have to learn the facts. But is that true? Is that a simplistic point of view? What do you think about that particular episode and how he treats history as fact?
I think it shows a pretty simplistic understanding of the past. And when I teach history methods, sometimes I teach about the development of historical consciousness, which has different phases. And one of the phases is history is fact, but that is not the most sophisticated. When you go beyond history is fact, the next level up in sophistication is confusion.
Oh,
which is, I don't know what's fact. I don't know what counts as, I don't know what I know, right? But that is actually a really essential and more sophisticated approach that helps to lead you into history as interpretation. That there are going to be things that you know pretty well. There will be other issues where you have interpretations. And that doesn't mean it's just your opinion and anybody's interpretation is as good as anybody else's. Interpretations are only as good as the evidence that there is to support them. And there are definitely invalid interpretations of history, ones that do not bear up under the evidence. But you have to actually figure that out, and you have to actually know something about the evidence. And this is why I always tell my students, this is why you do footnotes. This is why historians like footnotes. And we don't want it at the end, and we don't want it in a parenthetical where I have to go look up the book. I want to see what it is right there on the page, because I'm judging your interpretation by the quality of the evidence I can see in those footnotes. So, that is really crucial for understanding the limitations of what we can know about the past, and the fact that there are always going to be multiple approaches to any given situation in the past, or even people in the past. There are going to be multiple ways of understanding them as people. They're not all equally valid, but you can have multiple valid interpretations, right? That you have to then kind of figure out. Life is complicated and people are complicated, and they're not so easy to, divide into good, bad, and to put your finger on a person who you've never met and you're never going to meet, and who grew up in totally different circumstances from your own. We're all just doing our best to bring the past a little bit closer. The idea that we can, make history scientific fact is really a relic of the beginnings of the historical profession, which was in the late 1800s, at a time when the way that you made history sound like it wasn't just a literary discipline was to say it's like a science. And I often have my students talk about, is history more of an art or more of a science, right? Are we telling stories? Are we literary? And a lot of the postmodernists say you might as well be a novelist, because you don't know what's in the past. But like people who major in history and people who become historians, they don't really think that. Right. I always say, if you don't think you can really find out about what happened in the past as a historian, you just got to go jump off a bridge or something, because what's your whole purpose, right? Or just go make up a bunch of stuff. There are things that happened in the past, and we can know some of those things, but a fair amount of it, we are filling in the gaps. We're trying to understand, right? We have this piece of evidence, that piece of evidence. We have this person said this. We have an account of this. We have a receipt for that. And then we're trying to get ourselves into the mindset of people in the past, using judgment, using that historical empathy, using our imagination to really come up with what's the most logical explanation for why this happened, or why this person did what they did, or what have you. And so you have to engage imaginatively. It has to be creative. And when you take a pure fact view, you're also taking all of that emotion out, which is what Gradgrind wants to do, right? Facts, 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 nothing but facts. Let's take all the imagination out. for the circus performer, right? No, no imagination. Didn't have horses on the
Exactly.
wallpaper because a horse wouldn't be on the wall, right? That kind of stuff.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
so, it's really an attack on imagination. And as we know, J.K. Rowling, like those are the muggles, right? The bad muggles are the ones who attack imagination. And she's all about imagination, the importance of being able to imagine. And I believe that that is one of Benz's major shortcomings, is that he doesn't display imagination, and his
Mm.
inability to engage with myth in the Chamber of Secrets episode is just a classic example of that. If I had a student who, by the way, dared to interrupt my class. Now, I want students to interrupt me, and then asked a question like that, I would be so excited.
Yeah.
I would be so excited. Somebody has a question that's related to history that maybe we could talk about. But he's not, because he's he's really unable to engage imaginatively.
Hmm. It's funny because um, I just think it's so interesting that Binns is he clearly has so much knowledge, and it's important. Sure, it's important to know dates, and there are some things that are definitely like this battle definitely happened at this time in this year. But wouldn't it be so interesting if we had an account from Godric Gryffindor about the
Mhm.
Chamber of Secrets episode, or we had an account from Salazar Slytherin, and we were able to engage, these students were able to engage with these two perspectives. And is there actually a tunnel under the school that houses a giant snake? Turns out that there is, but
Right. Spoiler alert.
spoiler alert. But having that information and being able to analyze that information would have helped assuage, I would hope, some of those fears of, being stuck in a castle. And if somebody had just talked to Moaning Myrtle early
Mhm.
on in the book,
No joke.
like, just, you have another historical relic right there. But then again, Dumbledore's line that everybody talks about is like, oh, but of course I haven't told you.
I
That
think there are
talk
so many,
about.
and this is my sort of idea about Rowling really feeling like the history of this world is so important.
Mm-hmm.
She has all of these kind of witnesses or legacies from the past. I loved how you were talking about ghosts as this kind of imprint from the
Mm-hmm.
past that could be engaged with if we weren't just so intensely involved in our own present without
Mm.
thinking about, like, I wonder what Nearly Headless Nick could tell me about this, or Moaning Myrtle. Not only the ghosts, but think about the paintings. you know, these are people who knew things.
Yeah.
And we do have some evidence that they contain some vestige of what the person they represent knew and could maybe talk about. Uh, and so the kind of blindness that people have to the various ways they could be intersecting with the past and witnesses to the past is it's another obstacle
Yeah.
that has to be overcome, which is helpful to the plot. But
Yeah, it makes for a good story, and that's the good thing, is it makes for a good story. But half the time, you're kind of pulling your hair out looking at Harry going, just read the Hogwarts of history,
yeah,
just read the book,
right.
just read the book, buddy, you can do it,
Yeah,
I believe in you. So
right.
now we can, you know what, how about, would you be okay with skipping ahead a little bit and talking about Hermione?
Yeah, I was actually
let's
thinking, I was almost about to mention her. I was like, oh, but that was a question later on.
let's talk about Hermione then. we'll
Yeah.
we'll we'll talk some more about lecturing. But I one of the things you mentioned in this paper is the importance of teaching active listening through lectures, and we can go back to that
Mhm.
later. But you mentioned that Hermione, she's a great example of an active listener and someone who
Right.
learns well from lectures. She's one of the only people who could pay attention and listen not only to Binns's lectures, but to Umbridge's speech at the beginning of the school year in the Order of the Phoenix. And she was able to understand that, oh, hey, maybe the ministry is going to interfere. What do you think we can learn from Hermione as a case study for how students can learn from lectures, and perhaps Actually, let me rewind a little bit. Why do we think, I wonder why Hermione is the only one who seemingly can learn from boring lectures at Hogwarts. Like she had a really hard time with Lupin's experiential mode of teaching, and Hagrid. I mean, she did okay with Hagrid because she loves Hagrid, and we love Hagrid too, even though we don't want to be burned by blast-ended scroots every day. But she really thrives from this quote unquote factual kind of information and learning directly from a text and from a lecture.
Mhm.
So why is that, do you think? Like, what is it
Well,
about Hermione?
yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I really like about that is that shows like, and remember, like Hermione also doesn't like to fly.
True.
So she's not into the experiential learning so
Mm-hmm.
much. And I honestly think it has something to do with just how she is. We all
Mm-hmm.
have things that we tend to gravitate toward,
Yeah.
but the things that she's interested in are also what are practiced in traditional classrooms. And we
Mm.
know that she was a stellar student as a muggle in the muggle classroom.
Mm.
When you, so if you, when I was in grad school, we did this whole thing about learning styles, which I know is kind of bunk, right? They've said that's not really a thing. Mostly people should just be reading. Sort of
Yeah.
a boring result of that. Reading is really the best way to learn for everybody. But um, a group of us graduate students who were becoming teaching assistants, we learned about this and we had our own little test where we saw what our learning styles were. And it was a bunch of different disciplines in that group, but all of the historians except one were auditory learners.
Yeah.
That is, were listeners. And I don't think that's an accident because I think we gravitated to history because we liked the lecture, we liked the storytelling, we liked the listening part. The one person who was not an auditory learner was digital, and
Mm.
that's the note-taking piece, right? And so I think Hermione has those aspects. I think that she is somebody who she is interested in complexity,
Yeah.
and she has some discernment that she's been able to get from engaging with complex materials. She starts, actually, many scholars have talked about how over the course of the series, she becomes more critical of texts so that she's not just saying, oh, this must be the way it is from the way from what I'm reading, but hey, wait a minute, maybe Rita Skeeter's version of events is not all that,
Hmm.
right? So she actually becomes more discerning, but she is somebody who understands complexity, who likes it. She likes complexity, and she's just more. I think she's more comfortable with those traditional modes of
Yeah.
schooling, um, and so I think that she's gotten quite good at them. But
Mm-hmm.
that's not necessarily how you learn magic. A lot of the magic classrooms are, in fact, quite experiential. And so she's trying to bring some of those traditional modes into the classroom. And this is why she does well in some, and she does terribly in, astrology or
Yeah.
why it's divination, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so she's not good at all the classes, but she is good at some of those.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that through some of the traditional schooling that she got, she probably did become a good active listener and a good note taker. And I
Mm-hmm.
started by talking about what I think are the responsibilities of people who are lecturing, and especially historians who are lecturing, to engage with your audience, to be aware of them. Honestly, I think it's really important to continually ask them questions. And sometimes I ask them questions like, what do you think's going to happen next if this country says this to this country, right? Or like,
Mm-hmm.
how do you think this person might react when they hear about, whatever. So I try to give them things where they don't have to like know the right answer. There's just a like engagement with empathy. We
Mm-hmm.
have to using warm language, being sensitive to what your audience, whether your audience is with you, and stepping up the performance if you need to. But then the person who is the student also has obligations because they're not just an audience member. They're learners and they have a job to do. They're not
Mm-hmm.
just there to be entertained. They need to be, working on themselves and developing themselves, and they have obligations in that context as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's really important. And a lot of students don't think that now. There's so there's been something where we've told them, if you're bored, it's the teacher's fault or what have you. And it's actually really important to be able to work through boredom.
It is.
And I think that we're seeing what happens when, we're just focused on things that are entertaining. And we get people who cannot understand complexity and who are drawn in by propagandistic, simplistic, black, white kind of thinking and media and so on. And so for the learners, they also need to figure out how to learn from listening. And I think critical listening is something that students need to develop. And I would hope that they would be told why it's important for them. But I always think this, like, you're going to take lecture out of the classroom, but like, it's not as though students will never have to learn from listening to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
In your life, you will, and I actually tell my students this, you will have to sit in a long, boring meeting where your boss does nothing but talk at you, and he will not be nearly as interesting as I am. And you will still have to know everything that they want you to do. So what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I actually will also often tell them, if I know I'm going to be in a boring meeting, always take notes. I always take notes. Not only does it prevent you from falling asleep, which looks very bad to your employer,
Very much.
but it also, like, it keeps my brain functioning and I'm thinking about what the person is saying, and it helps you to sort through the waffle, as Hermione says. And she's not taking notes when Umbridge is speaking at the beginning of the 5th year. She's not taking notes, but because she has that practice, she is able to, note taking is not just stenography. And actually, they've said that really students should not be taking notes on a computer because it's
Mm-hmm.
more like stenography. And it doesn't pass through your brain before it passes into your fingers for typing. You can just type without actually internalizing anything, but you don't do that with handwriting. So I always encourage handwritten notes because you can't write down everything. That's the whole point. Students will say, you talk too fast. Well, yeah, I don't want you to write down everything. I want you to figure out what's important to write down.
Yeah.
And also write down things I didn't say. Write down what you think about this. Write down a question, something that keeps you in it. Stenography is not what we're all about. It's not just about, can you replicate the lecture? And I tell my students, when you are writing notes, you are making that material your own because it has to go through your brain. And when you do that, you become able to think about the material. And that's what critical listening, I think, actually is. And that's how Hermione, I think, is able to sort through the propaganda and the cliches and all of that Umbridge is talking about in book 5 at the beginning. And she's able to see, oh, this is what she's really doing. And
Mm-hmm.
how many times have we, I don't know if you do this, Elise, but I hear something, I'm like, there's something going on here that I don't get. And then I can hear hear from somebody, I hear somebody's analysis of, here's what's really going on in this. And they can fill in the context, or here's what this is a dog whistle for, or, here's the backstory behind this statement that you don't understand. And then you can really get it. And that has
Mm-hmm.
to do with having the background, being able to be a critical listener, and this is so important, not only for, doing your boss's bidding, obviously. I'm not really for that, actually. But living in a democratic society.
Exactly.
Yeah, and just being able to sort through very complex material and very different points of view and interpretations.
Yeah. That's perfect. So then what skills would you say that students need to effectively interact with lectures? It's one, I'll go back to what you've talked a little bit about what professors can and should do for lecturing, and we can talk about it some more. But then what skills, we see what skills Hermione is good at and what she has practice in. What can we as students and we as teachers teach our students to support and teach them the skills of note taking, active listening, and training ourselves to actively listen?
One of the things that I was thinking about, Elise, is reading aloud.
Yeah.
And I know as you teach a lot of literature, we got away from reading aloud in classrooms. And I think there's been a movement to bring it back. Am I right?
There has. It's a key component in literacy instruction nowadays, and it is supported by the science of reading and reading instruction.
Hmm.
So there
Right.
is research to support read alouds.
Right. And I think reading aloud and then not asking students to regurgitate, but asking them to put themselves in the story. Well, if you were
Mm,
this character, what would you think? And can you predict what's going to happen next? All of those things that I know people who teach reading are actually trying to do with students. And I think that you can do that with almost anything. So I will occasionally read aloud speeches in the history class, right? So that I will read aloud, for example, Pope Urban II's call to the Crusaders in 1095, 96. He, gives this speech and I read it to the students and I tell them in advance, here's what I want you to listen for. I
mhm.
want you to listen for how does he portray the Europeans, the Franks? How does he portray people who are Muslim, and what is the major message, right? And so then I read it, and I read it emotionally, right? I read it with all of my theater skills, and I especially emphasize certain things that are answering the questions that I'm asking. So I might even read a line twice, right? Um, so that they are right, they're being encouraged. And then I ask them at the end, so what do you hear? What did you hear in this? You can do that giving them a copy, but sometimes I do it just because I want to see if they can actually listen without reading along, because we have to teach them the ability to do that.
Agreed. And what as a literacy specialist, I could see you linking the oral language and speech, and the I was literally just teaching a class on the science of reading to parents who are trying to support their kids as they're going into school, and I told them we learn how to speak first. That's the oral language side of
Mm-hmm.
things, and we're connecting we're connecting your speech patterns with our letterbox, with what's going on in your occipital lobe, and making meaning out of that. So that oral language component is critical to learning and reading and dissecting and interpreting information. It's literally a left brain skill.
Mm-hmm.
And I do like that you've mentioned that sometimes you include the text, but sometimes you don't, because with a speech, I doubt that Pope Urban's well, I suppose constituents isn't the right word. Um, the Pope's followers would not have had the speech in front of them, quite literally, because they could not read. He quite literally had to convince people who could not read. He had to use those speech abilities and those theater abilities, as you mentioned, to get people to go fight in the Holy Crusades.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it wouldn't have necessarily just been him, right? There are people
Sure.
who are being sent out to deliver that speech, but that's how people were getting the message.
Mm-hmm.
I'll also do songs. I think
Yeah.
again, this is responsibility of the lecturer
Mm-hmm.
to bring in. I bring in newsreel footage, but I think music is really powerful, and I also think it's really important for students to learn that the music they're listening to is has messages that they need to be thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we play music and like, it's like, this sounds like this is like I'll play the Beatles, and I said, so this sounds like la 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 la, right? This is a happy, but like, what's this song about? And it's actually about social revolution.
Yep.
And it's like, and they're like, whoa, wait.
Where'd that come
Um,
from?
yeah, and sometimes it's totally contrary to the tone of the music itself. And that itself is making a statement. And so those critical listening skills are just really important for general awareness of the many messages that we get in many different kinds of media. And never in history has it been more important to be able to listen.
For sure. How about note taking? What do you recommend? What do you teach your students, especially in a history context, for when it comes to note taking? Because I know when I was growing up, I had to write down dates. I had to write down a lot of dates. I also had a weekly quiz where I received a map of the United States of America, and I had to not only label all 50 states, and I also had to label every capital city. So that was fun.
Cool. You know what? Maps are so important. Maps are
Oh
another
yes.
thing that I think we've got to, well, we got to make sure people know where basic things are, basic places. But yeah, so I think with note taking, there are good strategies that can be employed, but again, the student needs to make the notes their own. And
Mm-hmm.
some kinds of note taking are going to work for some and not for others. What I like is a kind of note taking that leaves a lot of white space on the page. So I encourage more like an outline, and not, because I think sometimes students are trying to write complete sentences. Like I'll write a paragraph about what this person is saying. And I think instead, think about it in terms of shorthand phrases, and leaving a lot of white space so that then you can go back. And as you read, you can write, oh, like, I don't understand what this is about, or how did this connect? I also encourage a lot of arrows, and right, this relates to this other thing, and boxes and other ways of setting apart certain aspects of the lecture for emphasis, to establish relationships between certain parts of the material. And all of that requires actually a lot of you and your brain actively working during the lecture. And that's why I say, like, listening to a lecture is not passive. If you're doing it correctly, you're doing a lot. You're thinking the whole time about how does this relate to this? And note taking is you putting that on a page in a way that you will be able to recreate your experience of listening. And hopefully that is also a kind of active learning in the process.
So, if I can, I just want to read a quote from your article. Actually, you
Oh,
said
sure.
good note takers are actively involved in creatively organizing and interpreting the information that they've heard. So they're not just copying down what you said, especially not word for word, because goodness knows I can't do that. Even if it's recorded lecture and I have to pause and go back, but I still need to creatively organize and interpret the information that I've heard in order to actively engage with it. It's one thing um, to write down that information, but if I go back and I look at it, I need to be able to interpret it again. I need to be able to understand what I've written.
Absolutely. And my goal for my students, and I think this is probably every teacher, when I am asking students something on a test or in a class, I don't just want to hear myself back. I really don't.
Yeah.
I want to hear what you got from it. How is it different now that it's been through your brain and you've thought about it and you've added your own life experience or your own opinions, your own ways of interpreting? That's what I'm interested in. And with history, it's so important that you actually do know some of the actual stuff, right?
Right.
And facts, if we want to call them facts, um, if you don't know, some of the actual events and people and so on, you don't really have anything to build off of. But almost no history teacher just wants the grad grind facts. They really, I think we're all working towards some kind of higher level of analysis, synthesis, integration of learning.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are note taking, that's like an in between uh, process of making it your own. And then when you come to the test, that knowledge is no longer what Dr. McDaniel said. That's what I know. This is what I know and what I think and how I would apply this to a new question or a new problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, of course, one of the highest levels of learning.
Yeah. I mean, can you imagine if the OWLs had been centered around, if instead of just talking about the Goblin Wars, but let's make up some new policies and some new um, ways of actually, I don't know, talking to the goblins and improving goblin relations instead of just going, here is the date that Uric the Oddball decided to go to war. I mean, if I'm thinking back to book 5 and there's a history of magic there was no, sorry, it was book 4 when the Weasleys come to visit Harry to support him during the Triwizard Tournament, and then Ron comes back and says, "Yeah, I kind of just made up names for my history of magic exam." And I'm just thinking to myself, as a kid, if I'm like, "Yeah, go for it, Ron, do that, no problem." And as a teacher, I'm like, "No, no, Ron, don't do that, Ron.
Yeah.
Actually learn the information, Ron."
Right.
But as a kid, of course, I'm like, yeah, it's just history, whatever. It's, I'm like, yeah, I did that. I'm sure I did that in my history. Oh man, I'm sure I did that. I made stuff up in my history exams as a student too.
I
But
tell you, I do get students who just make stuff up, and I just told them to stop doing that. And I think it's because I don't know what the ratings are on your podcast, but I basically just straight out tell my students, I don't want bullshit.
no,
We live in an environment in which people are manufacturing bullshit all the time.
all the
And
time.
I'm tired of it. I can't deal with it. So don't make up a bunch of stuff. Like, I know it's not right.
Yeah,
So you're not gonna like fool me by
yeah.
making up the crazy stories they make up. Elise, you wouldn't even believe it.
Oh, I know it's not Uric the oddball.
Just admit you don't really remember, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I also tell them, it's a lot of times they can't remember a name. And I'm like, don't just write a capital letter and then a squiggle, because I know you didn't know the name. I know you didn't know the name. But you can say, the Prime Minister of England during this period without
That
knowing the
is
name.
that is
That's
still
okay.
that's still a piece of fact. There was a prime minister during that time,
That's
and that prime
right.
minister did this thing.
If that's all you know, but please don't just make up a
Yeah.
bunch of bullshit. We need less of that. Less, please, of people just making up stuff and
Oh,
pretending like it actually has any kind of reality. Oh my God.
oh, that is social media in, yep, in
And all the
3 words or less.
conspiracy theories, right? Conspiracy
Yeah,
theories are just manufactured stuff.
we have to learn to be critical again. And
And not critical like I do my own research. It's the internet research.
it's analyzing the research and
Yeah,
understanding
yeah.
where it comes from.
And valuing expertise, like really understanding expertise.
Just because Stacy from Idaho says that raw milk is good for your children does not mean you should feed your children raw. I literally saw this the other day, and I'm just like, there's a reason why pasteurization exists. There's a
Right.
reason why we pasteurize milk, because raw milk has bacteria.
Mhm.
Sorry.
There was a really funny, I'm not sure if you're going to want to include this, but
That's
there's a
okay.
really funny incident in the West Virginia legislature
Oh
where they
no.
passed something that basically said that you could serve raw milk, or like it was not requiring pasteurization. And to celebrate passing this law, the West Virginia legislators drank raw milk on the floor, and then there were a bunch of them who got really sick. I shouldn't laugh
Wow.
at the misery, but I was like,
No, but they
you brought
walked
that on
themselves into this.
yourselves.
They brought that on themselves. Like, if they fed raw milk to some unsuspecting constituent to celebrate it, then I would be, but no, they did it to themselves. They got their come up. Oh my God. There are just some really dumb takes out there. There are some really dumb takes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, one thing that I do think is helpful in that we're, or rather, maybe not helpful, but we are willing to at least question what, there are some parts that are important that we can question, like what has been told to us. Like for the longest time, so it's one thing to be told, this is history, this is how it is, and this is how we see it. But then you get other perspectives. For example, we've been given a lot of white Eurocentric history over the years, and for a long, without perhaps certain quote unquote takes on the internet, or just other perspectives that are now more easily accessible and not hidden behind an academic paywall. I can now interact with more critical history, especially when it comes to perspectives that are non-white and are perhaps indigenous, or that are that are not Eurocentric and are that are not Christian. So on the one hand, you don't want to go out, like you said, not every interpretation is valid and needs to be backed by evidence. but we're getting more evidence that is not one particular, that is more diverse and more and multidimensional, and understanding. And now I understand as an adult that history is multidimensional. And as you said, a narrative history, it is composed of multiple narratives.
Right. And so that's so I like I'm just absolutely 100% totally in agreement, nodding at everything that you're saying there, because I just couldn't agree more. And the chapter that I wrote for the Ivory Tower, Harry Potter and Beyond that Lana White had just put out is really about that, because J.K. Rowling on the Wizarding World website, those little histories that she gives are like parody histories. They're written like in a like a historical voice and so on. And she doesn't realize that when she does that, she is mimicking the very Eurocentric, ethnocentric, and colonizing way of doing history that really was, it was just what history was from the professionalization of history in the 19th century forward into about the first half of the 20th century. And she's doing it as a, she is kind of parodying the style, but it leads her into some really rough territory. And if you remember all of the kick up about her History of Magic in North America series, where she just, it was terrible, especially regarding the indigenous populations of the Americas and the way that she lumped them all together, and she kind of appropriated certain practices without really understanding them and brushed them aside. And then, the idea that they just wanted to learn the magic that the European magical people were bringing with them at Ilvermorny when it was brought up, right? They had been homeschooled. And so I do, in that chapter, I do a whole read on that is basically talking about what she's doing as a real form problem that historical scholarship had for a long time. And it's not been that long since historians have really started to challenge that. And we're doing much better with it, but there are a lot of ways that we are blind to how the way that we structure narratives about history, how that narrative structure does eliminate the voices of people who are not in the dominant positions.
Mm-hmm. And I would, well, I would hope that Hermione is able to do that when analyzing certain speeches and analyzing certain events. But she does have a blind spot when it comes to the house elves. So who knows? When it comes to social justice, when it comes to the house elves, she gets a little tricky there.
Yeah, and I think that she like I think her heart is in the right place there. But that she is really trying to tell them what they should want.
Yeah. I was teaching for Signum Academy for a while, and I read with a group of 4 kids who were just really into Harry Potter. And I asked them, what do you guys think about the way that Hermione talks about the house elves and Spew? And one of my students said, I wonder how she was taught and he was like super into history and social studies. Like he could riff off all the dates of every this boy could riff off all the dates of every historical interaction that you could think of. If I needed a historical context on something, he was my go-to kid. So he was like, I wonder how Hermione was taught about slavery and about enslavement, whether from a British perspective and he lists or from an American's perspective. And he listed a whole bunch of like things she might have learned in a historical classroom during her time as in the Muggle world. And he was thinking about like European colonization. He was thinking about like, there are certain things that you're taught in school about how enslavement and how to think about these things. Like we're taught, of course, that, and obviously, we're taught like, we don't do this anymore because slavery is wrong. But why did we do it we don't really talk about why, slavery was such a booming, was why slavery existed in the first place. Like we didn't talk a lot about those problems in, in elementary school and things like that. And Hermione probably would not have, but she would have had this sort of, and the student said maybe she had this idea in her head of what it was like, and maybe she learned from a historical context in her school, and now she's trying to apply this sort of blanket. I don't think he said this, but I interpreted it as color blindness almost to the house elves. Like, this is what I think about it, and now I want to free you from this. And without considering all of the contexts and talking to the house elves themselves about what they would want. She just had this one perspective of what enslavement looks like, and it definitely applies to house elves, and I must free them, without considering what happens when a house elf is freed.
So one of the things I think is really interesting is the way we talk about liberation in history, and think about how we think about the liberation of slaves in the United States. We think of white people liberating, enslaved Black people. Like that's the way that story is told. And in doing that, we basically erase all of the people of color who were advocating for themselves and who did so much for themselves. And they become almost sidelined in really their own story and their story of agency. A lot of people in talking about Holocaust history have been trying to emphasize how Jewish people were not just victims, but they were fighting, and they did a lot in terms of resistance. And that it is so important to be able to articulate those parts of the history as we understand, how does liberation happen? How does freedom happen? And it does come from within groups, and is not just something that is handed over by the dominant group, which is how we tend to see it. And that's one of my big critiques of the way Rowling presents history in those Wizarding World essays.
Oh,
She
for
just is
sure.
not able to see it. And I call it a blind spot. She's just got a colonizer's blind spot. One of the things I talk about is how Quidditch becomes a colonizing sport, and Quidditch comes from Europe. If you read how she describes the history of Quidditch, and you can see this in Quidditch Through the Ages, she talks about how it originates in Europe, and then you have, like the Japanese come to really love Quidditch, and they become really great Quidditch players. And it's, but if you look at the colonial history of, say, cricket in India, it's really, there's something similar. It's colonization through sport culture. And like, she just embraces it uncritically without even thinking about what she's really talking about with the spread worldwide of Quidditch. And it's really interesting when you start to think about it that way. When my students sort of saw that's where I was going, I taught Quidditch Through the Ages a couple of times.
Yeah.
And they were like, what? Like, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
You can't unsee it at all.
But she doesn't see it. She does not seeing that herself. And I think it's really instructive about, like, we all have those. We all have those things that, because we're coming from our own particular perspective, we're just not able to see the other perspectives. But it's so important to be able to think, in those like multivocal ways.
Yeah. And it's great that we are getting, I do like that we're still, getting these arguments and looking at not only history, but magical history, and a text from an extremely problematic author who has very problematic ideas, not only about, white saviorism and colonization and European colonization, but about what it means, what gender means, and what sexuality means. And we're still engaging in these critical discussions, and understanding that there's not only is there not one way to engage with a text, but there's not one way to engage with and present history. And that we can look at this story and say, there's issues, there's problems, here they are, now let's talk about them.
One of the things that's interesting, if I can just bring it back around to voice, one of the main critiques I think that I've heard about why people are so angry at Rowling for expressing an opinion that a lot of people actually have, right? Why throw her out, right? And obviously I'm not somebody who thinks, I really don't throw people out. But, and I think people are complicated and people are a mix. But I understand people who just want to throw her out. Part of what they're angry about is that she has a loud voice by
Yeah.
virtue of her fame and status and wealth. And she very often has used that voice for the benefit of people who are marginalized and oppressed. And that is not what she's doing now. And
Yeah.
that fact that she has this one loud, dominant voice and she's not listening to other people. Many people have tried to reach out to her and to just, to sort of have a conversation, and she's not open to it.
Yeah.
And so she's not listening. She's already done her listening and she's decided.
Yeah.
And I try to keep myself listening. I always want to keep myself flexible and listening, especially when it's something I don't know all about.
Right. Exactly. There are certain perspectives that we just don't have. And
Mhm.
it's so revealing through, what this text tells us, not just about, about biases, but what about how certain things are taught and how someone like Rowling has come to the conclusions that she has come to.
Mhm.
And okay, that was a bit of a sidebar to
Sorry.
digression, but it's okay. I
Sorry.
love it. So then, yeah. How do we?
Yeah, where we get?
What's
How do
the,
we get back
where
from
were
that?
we? So we talked
Well, yeah, we
about
were talking about like history has been traditionally one of the tools of colonization and one of
yeah.
the tools of European superiority.
Mm-hmm.
And historians have to work really hard to stop that from being the case. And in fact, there are a lot of people who say we should do history the way that Europeans, have said to do it. It shouldn't be this evidence-based and shouldn't have these kind of fact scientific qualities, right? It should be all about story and oral tradition and all of that. And it shouldn't be linear in our way of thinking
Yeah.
about time. We need to think about time in ways that reflect different ways that indigenous populations have thought about time. That's not just this kind of very Christian, European, linear, progressive perspective. And all of those are, I think, really important. And the historical profession has been really forced to struggle with a lot of those. And Ben's is really just a classic example of somebody who couldn't change. He's already dead.
Yeah.
He's
He's already
not
dead.
able to
He's not
change.
gonna. Yeah. He
No,
he
he's
he
not
literally
changing.
cannot change.
Right.
He
But
can't grow any older.
those of us who are still alive, we can change and we can adapt and we can figure out how to make our narratives better and more accurate to what happened in the past.
In your paper, I think you mentioned, but we were talking before we started recording, that at the time you were kind of being pressured to move away from lectures
Right.
and to be, have discussions and do very active learning models. And this paper kind of documents your frustrations with why we can't throw out lectures entirely. And
Yeah.
I would love to know more of your thoughts about why at the obvious, and at the time, this was a push against lecturing and for active learning. So then why not throw out lectures entirely, and why, you've mentioned a lot like why they're necessary. So where would you say is that middle ground then? Like what should
Right.
bins have done instead, for
Right. So
example?
yeah, now I was telling you that I could feel the defensiveness in my writing, and you still get some of this where it's like, gosh, this just lecture, like we don't want to just lecture to our students. It's become a really easy, like whipping boy for, sort of let's do the latest new thing. But my point in the article is that no teaching methodology is perfect,
No.
and they can all be done badly. Like, how many times have you had student presentations that just reinforced the wrong ideas and that showed they were not what they were supposed to be? Or, student discussions that went totally off track and did not help them learn the material. Like, there are all kinds of ways that any teaching strategy can go wrong. So you have to
Mm-hmm.
do a good job with it. And I think that people just assume that, when you're starting teacher, especially college teacher, that you're going to know how to lecture because you've seen a lot of lectures. But especially with PowerPoint, boy, did PowerPoint also make lecturing really bad as people just read aloud like copious amounts of text from their PowerPoint slide that everybody was reading along with. I mean, oh my God, shoot me now. So I think people really need lessons in
Yes.
how to lecture well. I
Hmm.
also think lectures need to be interactive. And that means, as I sort of mentioned, you asking them questions, you being open to them asking you questions. A lot of times I will put up a picture and ask their thoughts on the picture. You interpret it. What do you see here? And then lead that into something more, or give them a song, give them a primary source. And all of that can be incorporated within the lecture. But
Mm.
lecturing still remains important because, especially with history, which is a narrative discipline, as we were talking about, the story is important. And the students, there's no better way to get the story than to have it narrated to you, than to have it told to you. And there are ways to do it well and ways to do it badly. Hopefully, we'll do
Hmm.
it well. But it's also, I call it a real act of generosity for somebody to share their knowledge and wisdom so directly and openly. It also, anybody who's taken a history class knows you always get behind. You always get behind in history class, right? So lecturing is really one of the one of the best ways to convey some pretty significant amounts of content fairly efficiently. If I have to try to do everything by group discussion, like we're never going to get very far. And so sometimes we just have to, we sometimes, the narrative part is a way to actually go get through material like coverage. People are like coverage, but no, coverage is a real thing when you're
Yeah.
actually trying to give people a sense of the timeline of the human past. And so I think those are all really important. And I feel like when a professor is really, or a teacher of any kind is really cognizant of their audience and is also passionate about the material and sort of generously constructs a an approach to the material that then they are willing to give over to their audience for them to do with it as they will in their own notes, in their own minds. To me, that is some of the best of teaching, and we shouldn't just give it up. And not only just for the practical reasons that people have to learn from listening in the
Yeah.
rest of their lives as well, but also because I think it's actually a great way to learn.
It is. Yeah. So the methods you mentioned in your paper for what you use as, good practice for lecturing, because, like you said, it's not meant to be passive. So front loading questions before the lecture so that students can listen for salient points and can
Right.
respond to those points. Teaching students how to generate questions during and after the lecture. I can't tell you how many times I've had to say to my students, this is how you generate a question.
Mm,
Because at the end of a lecture, I'll go, does anyone have any questions? And of course, you get the crickets.
mhm.
So then that's a skill that needs to be taught. Um,
Absolutely.
you talked about note taking strategies. You've talked about encouraging involvement during the lecture through asking questions, generating discussions. I love your use of like primary sources and art because I mean, art is an interpretation of
Mhm.
a historical event. I mean, just what's popping into my mind right now is the Battle of Trafalgar. There's a giant picture. I think it's in Parliament. There's a giant picture, a giant painting of Admiral Lord Nelson's death at the Battle of Trafalgar, and it's a very big, very dramatic piece. And I can just think of all the discussions that could come from just looking at that one piece.
Yeah. So
Um,
here's an example. I will play. I do this at the beginning of class before class starts when I'm talking about modernism, beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And I play Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which I don't know if you've heard it, but it's not catchy and you can't dance to it.
no,
Right? It's a lot of, but it sounds very modern, but it's discordant and it's got lots of almost frenetic, uh, very weird sounds combining together. It's hard on the ear. But then I asked students at the end, like, how did that make you feel?
Mm.
And they're like, anxious, and like, I feel upset now. And and gosh, that was like, it stirred me up. I'm all revved up, or whatever it is. And I say, like, that's modernity. Right. And so then we go into our discussion of what is modernism. And so then, to me, that's also a way that they can remember these are the qualities of modernity. It's disconnected, it's not harmonious, it is full of anxiety, and it's very fast paced. And it's not an easy or restful
Mm.
way to be. And that, I think, that music just kind of sums it up. So when I find things like that, and I do that with art, and I do that with poetry and so on, I try to use those not only as ways that students can analyze what we're doing or apply the content that they're getting from the lecture, but that it gives them something they can take with them, and it makes things more memorable, even if they haven't written it in their notes.
Yeah. Oof. I probably wouldn't forget a modernity lesson after listening to the what's it,
Rite of Spring.
the Rite of Spring. I probably
Yeah.
wouldn't forget it after that. And like you said, it's not, like you said earlier, history is not just facts, it's also feelings, and it's also somebody
Mhm.
presenting those feelings through speeches or through music, and we have to analyze that and analyze those perspectives. And oh,
Mhm.
hey, look at the person who didn't have a voice for a long time, and is the here's the perspective that we haven't, that we haven't engaged in, and here's another perspective that we need to engage in, and oh, look, there's another perspective that we can engage in too. You know what if we
Yeah.
were to give, so here, let me put it in the form of an exercise. Let me try this.
Yeah.
So Katie, what if bins were willing to actually sit through professional
Mm.
development? Well, he is dead,
That's a
so
big
I don't know.
if.
It's a big
Yeah.
if. But if someone like Binns were to be given professional development, not only in the teaching of history, but also teaching through lectures, what are some of the salient points that you think Binns should learn about teaching and active
Mhm.
listening and lecturing that he completely missed
Right.
in his tenure as a history of magic teacher?
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, it's not just about the history, Professor Benz, but you also have to be aware of your students. You have to be aware of the present and the future that they represent, and you've got to be aware of your audience. And if you don't have them, if they're not right there in the palm of your hand, you have to figure out how to get them. And that can be done through relevant examples, connecting to the present or to their own lives. It can be done through warm language that invites them to actively imagine themselves in the past, to empathize with the situations of past people. I actually use a lot of humor. That's something that I didn't mention a lot, but I really emphasize the kind of the absurd, or, I use exasperation, you know, as a way to try to get students emotionally engaged. Because yes, it is about what actually happened, but none of that matters if we don't have a way to engage emotionally with it. That's actually really important. And then also, I think it's important to incorporate interactive strategies and like multiple voices, so that it's not just your voice, but you can, use the art of the time. You can, how about having some goblins, goblins telling you why they are fighting in those rebellions. You could definitely do that. Again, as a way to help students to engage. So having interactive elements in the lecture so that it's not just unbroken people being talked at. On the other side, I think Ben's could, again, this is a way to engage with your students, to help the students figure out what they should be doing on their end in terms of trying to make sure that information is going through their own heads, writing notes that are effective but are not like stenography, that are not just writing down everything, and trying to bring themselves to the material in a way that will help them to integrate it into and make it really their knowledge in the end. To me, all of those elements revive this, this kind of what was considered the dead art of lecturing, and bring it back into the present, because as I said, I think it is a really effective and generous mode of teaching. It doesn't have to be, the sage on the stage, it doesn't have to be the ghost lecturing and nobody's, he's not even cognizant of the students. It really can be done very well. And I think probably everybody who's listening can think of a teacher they had who was a wonderful lecturer that they did learn a lot from. It is possible.
It is. Katy, thank you so much for coming to Teaching with Magic. And thank you so much for teaching us about the teaching of history through magic. Wow. I just made that up. I'm so brilliant. How did I do that?
I love it. I love it.
Katy, thank you so much. And if we want to read some more of your work and engage with some more of your content, I'm sure I'll put this in the beginning, but you are one of the hosts of the Potterversity, a Potter Studies podcast. Where
Absolutely.
else can we read your work? Can we see your work? Can we engage with your work?
Right. So Potterversity you can get to on MuggleNet, or you can just Google Potterversity. We also have a Potterversity book that came out that has essays in it. And I wrote an essay in there about Arthur Weasley. It's called Arthur Weasley and the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts. And it sort of engages with the colonial question of whether he's whether he's an appropriator of Muggle goods. Is he being colonialist when he transforms the Ford Anglia into a magical vehicle? And I think it's such a fun question to think about, but also important. Let's see, and I do have the Secrecy and Segregation in the Wizarding World's Hidden Histories in the Ivory Tower, Harry Potter, and Beyond. I have also written about the house elves. We talked a little about the house elves, but I have a house elf article. It was originally called The Elfin Mystique.
Yes.
And then the follow-up, I wrote that before the books were finished, but the follow-up to that was The Real House Elves of J.K. Rowling. And it's about this problem of liberation. And I really look at the house elves in the lens of feminist theory. Like, what do you do with, domestic people who are bound in domestic servitude, who sort of don't want to be free? And how do you understand that? Exactly what we were talking about in our discussion. I also am the editor of Harry Potter for Nerds 2, and that article is in that, or that chapter is one of the chapters in the book. And I also wrote something about, it was called Dumbledore's Army and the White Rose, which connects some students at the University of Munich who are speaking out against Hitler with the Dumbledore's Army kids at Hogwarts, and seeing a lot of really amazing parallels. I feel sure J.K. Rowling knew the story of the White Rose when she wrote Harry Potter, because that's I don't think those things can be accidental. Anyway, I've written a ton of stuff on these on all of this, and I'm very Googleable. So I hope that people will read and engage, and we'd love to have more listeners to the podcast and tell us what your ideas are and all of that.
Wonderful. Again, Katy, thank you so much. And
Thank you,
you're
Elise.
always welcome back.
Thanks.
Listeners, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your other favorite podcast feeds. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a rating and a review as well. You can read and find out more about Teaching with Magic by visiting our website, teachingwithmagic.blog. You can leave a message on our podcast page, read past Teaching with Magic posts, and check out our book lists on our affiliate page. We also invite you to support us on Patreon. You'll have access to bonus material, our Discord channel, live Q&As, and you'll get a sneak peek at future products such as lesson plans, worksheets, and other teaching tools. The link is always available in our show notes and the podcast page on our website. Thanks again for joining us, and as always, keep making magic.